second talk today, and the speakers are John Markin, Nikki Brooks, and Brian White, and they're going to talk to us today about could diminishing aggression in the invasive Argentine ants lead to supercolony collapse?
All right, so today we're going to tell you a little bit about our project that we did investigating the social structure of these Argentine ants in order to build a model to better understand this social structure and make claims about its stability. So why we even did this in the first place is because Argentine ants are an invasive species, and being an invader, they're an environmental concern, and a lot of research is given to understand what problems they are causing and why they are causing these problems. And why they're causing these problems is largely in part to the fact that they form supercolonies, have this strange social structure. And the supercolonies are rather difficult systems to understand, though, so given that they're difficult to understand, it's good to make a model and try and make claims from that. So today what we're going to do is talk about these Argentine ants, introduce them, bring up their biology, bring up their story, and talk about why their supercolony structure is so strange, and why we think it's expected to collapse over time, to break apart over time. And we'll bring up the model that we have to try and show this collapse, and the results we have so far that demonstrate our model working as intended, performing the functions we intend, and we'll bring up the ongoing work that we have planned, the changes we're going to be making as we try and finish. All right, so these ants, these Argentine ants, they come from Argentina, as their name suggests, where they live along the floodplains of the Parana River, shown in this picture, the red line. In this habitat that they call home, they face very unpleasant conditions. They live in close quarters at high population densities, where they compete over the limited habitats that they have available along this river. And in this competition, they show some very intense intraspecific aggression. They're always fighting each other. There's groups of ants at consistent war with each other. And the thing about these groups that they form is that they're not just a typical ant colony, but they're rather supercolonies. To understand supercolonies, we have to first describe what a colony exactly is. So in colonial species of ants, in a typical ant species, we find colonies exist as a queen or queens living with their workers, their offspring that they produce. And in this colony, in this nest, they distinguish themselves from the other nests, the other colonies in the population. So in this one picture, this is a visualization of what that would look like. Each dot is its own colony, and in each is just queens with their workers, and they separate themselves from each other. But in supercolonial species, if you were to look at a nest in a supercolony, what's different about it is that it has many queens, multiple queens, each coming from a different background, from a different family, and not only living with their workers that they produce, but also with workers from strangers from other colonies in the area. So in this picture, we see that supercolonies are basically massive collectives of colonies that cooperate as if just one massive colony. And in Argentina, where the Argentine ants fight each other, they fight as supercolonies, so it's not just a nest versus one nest versus another nest, or one colony versus another, but it's entire collectives of ant colonies fighting each other. So the wars are pretty aggressive, and they last a long time, and this has led to the evolution of some pretty vicious ants. These Argentine ants are. So given that they're so vicious, when they escape Argentina, though, if they were to escape Argentina, then they find themselves in habitats where they don't face equal competitors. Nothing is really a match for an Argentine ant supercolony. So they have escaped Argentina before, and the first time we ever saw them do this, the first time we witnessed them leaving Argentina and getting elsewhere in the world, was in 1891 when they were spotted in New Orleans. And within a century, there have been enough introduction events such that these supercolonies can now be found on every continent except for Antarctica. And they're an environmental concern. This is a very threatening spread because, being so aggressive, they exterminate ants in ecosystems that they invade and remove whatever, or disrupt whatever functions those ants perform in the ecosystem that they're native to. So when we look closely at this spread, though, and we see that the populations, the invasive populations of supercolonies are very different than the ones in the native range in Argentina. In Argentina, there's a whole bunch of supercolonies always fighting with each other, but in the rest of the world, there's just a few supercolonies that have expanded for thousands of miles that or the nests inside don't fight each other. So we can look at a place like California, and in these images, yellow dots indicate nests from the same supercolony. You can tell whether nests from like Southern California to North California are part of the same supercolony, because if you take workers from each and mix them together, they don't fight, they don't avoid each other, they just cooperate with each other and they accept each other into the nest. So what we see is not only can you find like a single supercolony spanning across all of California or all the way from Italy to the western coast of Spain, but we see in these red squares that you can take ants from California, Hawaii, Japan, New Zealand, and Europe, and they'd still actually cooperate with each other. So these supercolonies have expanded incredibly, and they show cooperation, recognition of each other across entire continents. So how this is possible is, it seems very strange. I mean, for an individual to recognize some stranger on the other side of the world as like a nestmate, as its own friend, is very strange. But in ants, it makes sense, because all they need in order to consider another individual as part of their own nest, as part of their own colony, is for that other individual to display a chemical recognition cue that says, hey, I'm part of your nest. So these chemical recognition cues are cuticular hydrocarbons. There's just these chemicals on the surface of their body that give them a smell that identifies them with a specific colony. So you can take an Argentine ant from Australia and bring it over to California, and as long as it displays the same smell as ants in California, then it'll be treated as if it's part of the same colony. So this doesn't solve the question, though, or at least it brings up the question that how have Argentine ants, these invasive supercolonies, been able to remain so consistent in this colony odor across entire continents, even though they haven't been interacting with each other and have been capable of gene flow and other things like that. So the explanations for this involve, one, that there's a population bottleneck that these introduced populations face, so that their genetic diversity is so low. Maybe it's just really difficult for changes to this colony odor to even occur. And along with that, though, if changes to the colony odor were to occur, they get eliminated pretty easily, because the Argentine ants are so aggressive to outsiders. Here's them fighting outsiders. And while we can at least show that, well, this does at least explain, okay, why it might be consistent over such a large range, over such a long time, it still doesn't explain, it still doesn't justify the idea that the supercolony could be stable. What makes supercolonies, the social groups, seem so unstable can be revealed when you think about the relatedness in a supercolony. So the relatedness in a usual ant colony justifies their cooperation, their altruism, the social behaviors that they show. And the reason why is because if you think about a single ant colony, one that's not an Argentine ant, but just some other ant, they're basically just very large families. And when an organism helps its family, it helps its own genes into the next generation, improving its relative fitness in the population. But in supercolonies, given that they're made up of a whole bunch of colonies intermixing, having multiple queens from different backgrounds and workers from separate nests all working together, we see that relatedness within a nest is pretty low in these supercolonies. So they're analogous to something not like a family, but rather unrelated individuals that just behave like a family for some reason. So given that an ant in a supercolony helping its own nest, it doesn't make sense how that improves its relative fitness. It's hard to understand why this social structure could ever be selected for, or why it could even remain over time. So this has led a lot of people to believe that there's an expected collapse that's going to occur, because what supercolonies are built on is an unstable social strategy. So if it's exploitable this way, the fact that they treat strangers as kin, it's likely that there could be some natural selection for more selfish behaviors over time that leads to the breakup of the supercolony. Now, there's been a bunch of theories brought up to a bunch of like different selfish behaviors hypothesized that could occur that could lead to the fragmentation of a supercolony. But what's the problem with these theories is that they rely on the presence of behaviors that currently aren't observed in Argentine ants. So what we wanted to do, because we're interested in this question, is also make a claim about how the supercolony might collapse, but instead just look at behaviors that we know are confirmed to occur in Argentine ants. So what we look at is their aggression, because we know that aggression, it plays a part in keeping the supercolony together and selecting against outsiders who are arising within the group. And we do know that we do know that the aggression can vary over time, that it might actually diminish over time. by a process like genetic drift in invasive ranges, because in invasive ranges, how they're different from Argentina is that they face hardly any competition with each other. They go thousands of miles, like all across all of California, just cooperating with each other. So what we try and do is show that there could be some sort of genetic drift or some change in the social structure by just making an evolutionary model where we simulate Argentine ants interacting with accounting for the fact that their aggression levels and the recognition factors they bear could change over time, and see if that's enough for the social structure to break down over time.
So the model we came up with is spatially explicit, stochastic, and agent-based, and we developed it using the R programming language. The agents in our model are ant colonies with 3 different characteristics. The first one is population size. The next one is an odor value, which represents the hydrocarbon profile. And the last one is aggression level. And so if an ant colony is at or above 0.5 aggression level, it's considered to be aggressive, which means that they will offensively attack enemies. And if it's below 0.5 aggression level, they're considered a neutral colony, which means they only defend against attacks. Here is the basic structure of our model. Each of these events is simulated for each time step, and then with the exception of introductions, which only happen every 100 time steps. And the first step is growth, which is where the colony's population size grows according to logistic growth function. The next step is war. There's 3 factors that really determine if a colony goes to war. The first one is the population size. If they're too small, they won't go out and attack because that's too high of a cost. The next factor is the aggression level. So like I was talking about earlier, if they're a neutral colony, they won't go out and attack. But if they're aggressive, they will attack their enemies. And then the last one is the identity of their neighbors. Different supercolonies are always considered to be enemies, but then there's also some fighting that can happen within a supercolony if the odor values are significantly different. So here is a visualization of our model that kind of shows war going on. Here is an aggressive red colony, and then the blue one, these ones are aggressive, and then these ones are neutral. So the picture on the right shows after some time steps have gone by, you can see that the neutrals have pretty much been eliminated. There's only a couple right down here because the aggressive ones were able to attack and defeat them because they're better at war. The next event is expansion, and this is where colonies have a chance to grow spatially. If there's empty cells, which are the green ones right here, all these are empty, then a colony can move into that if they have enough resources, if their population size is big enough. And then you can also see that since there's not any enemies around them, in this picture you'll see the different colors are aggressives and neutrals. So that's just because there's not selection for or against being aggressive. The next step is mutation, which is a random probability for a colony to change in odor level or aggression. In these pictures, it's aggression that's changed. So on the left is a picture of an aggressive colony, probably close to 0.5. And then here you can see that a neutral popped up randomly. The next step is gene flow, which allows colonies to mix their odor value and their aggression level to become more like each other. So you can see right here there's some neutrals and then the rest are aggressives, but then over time they became all aggressive. In the introductions stage, new supercolonies are introduced. So that's just like a supercolony, anywhere from 1 to 4 colonies is randomly placed on the board, overtaking whatever used to be there. So you can see right here a new supercolony popped up. And then the last step is random death, which is just random probability for a supercolony to die. We collect a lot of different statistics and then plot them on a couple different graphs. So you can see in this graph, we're plotting average aggression level of a supercolony. So the different colors are different supercolonies, just so you can see the change over time. And the dotted lines are plus or minus 2 standard deviations away from that average. This middle graph shows the proportion of aggressive colonies, which is just like the comparison of neutrals to aggressive colonies within a supercolony. And this last graph shows the number of intra-supercolony fighting. Like I mentioned earlier, if the odor values are significantly different, there will be fighting within a supercolony. So this just shows kind of the density of that. This graph right here shows the distribution of the odor value. That way you can kind of see the different variations that are happening. In this case, it's normally distributed. And then this graph shows the percent of the board occupied by each supercolony so that you can kind of see which supercolonies are more dominant than others. These are some visualizations of larger boards that we have used. This one right here is 100 by 100 as well as this one over here. They're a little more scattered than the one you see in the middle just because we used some different parameters that allowed more space. The board in the middle is a 50 by 50, and you can really see like clear borders forming between the supercolonies. After developing our model, we came up with some experiments and tests to complete just to show that our model was really working how we expected it to. So the 20 by 20 experiments we did were mainly to test the function of war and just to really show like aggression versus neutrality and how they differed. And then some of the testing we did was just kind of to see what patterns arose and what happened there. John's going to talk more about that.
Okay. All right, so I'll just quickly run through some of the tests that we did. So the first one that we did was basically make sure that our model would be able to support a condition that looked like the native range, in which you have a large number of small supercolonies kind of competing with each other and keeping each other in check. And we did see that essentially once this state where you have several different colonies occupying a roughly equal distribution of the board, this state managed to persist for a very large number of time steps, at least on a 20 by 20. And so we were pretty confident that our model would be able to support an end result that we would think a supercolony collapse would look like. Then we tried and look at the potential of an invader in order to intrude into a dominant supercolony. And so what we did was essentially let one supercolony grow in size until it almost saturated the board and then introduced invasions of other foreign supercolonies to see how well they would persist. And so these graphs are tracking the average aggression level of the supercolony over time, and each color represents a different supercolony. And so you can see this blue line is the initial supercolony that was dominating the board. And when it's at a very high aggression level, each invader kind of pops in and exists for one turn and gets eliminated immediately afterwards. So for a very aggressive supercolony, there's no chance for any sort of invasion to occur. When the aggression level drops a little bit lower, so it's still aggressive but not as aggressive as before, you see some more persistence in invaders. This green one lasted long enough for a third supercolony to appear later, but you still see that none of them can actually persist for any sort of significant amount of time. And so we see that as long as the colony is aggressive, you really can't do anything to take over the dominance of a pre-existing supercolony. When we ran the same test using neutral dominant supercolonies, we got completely different results. You see here that this blue line is at 0.1 aggression is the dominant supercolony, but as soon as an invader pops in, even if their aggression level is lower, they manage to persist and thrive. And eventually what we see over time is that they eventually reach a sort of stable distribution in steady state that's similar to the Argentina test that we showed earlier when the colonies are all neutral. So when you put all these graphs side by side, you see that as aggression level diminishes, the potential for the supercolony to be invaded successfully greatly increases, at least qualitatively. And so we also tried a test where we put an invader into a dominant supercolony that was mostly aggressive with a neutral region inside, which is what we would expect to see in the real world if there's going to be diminishing aggression in supercolonies in the invasive range. And we saw some very interesting phenomenon in our model. For example, the fact that the aggression level of the invader supercolony seemed to decrease over time pretty steadily when it was introduced into the neutral region. And this makes sense given the selection that our model would exhibit, because if this colony is surrounded by enemies that aren't going to fight it, there's no reason for it to waste resources fighting its enemies when it can just wait for things like random death to open up spaces to expand into. And so those were some interesting phenomenon. And so we do see that when you have neutral regions in a large aggressive dominant supercolony, then invasion can persist and succeed. We also ran some experiments on larger 100 by 100 boards, and we saw some interesting phenomenon here as well. In this case, we started with one supercolony in a very small portion of the board and allowed introductions to occur. And these introductions managed to persist because the board was so large that they did not usually interact with the supercolony until they had become large supercolonies themselves. And we do see some interesting trends such as conversions to specific aggression levels. For example, it's very prominent up in these 3 supercolonies here. They all seem to converge to a level of 0.8, which is interesting because on the board, they're not necessarily all adjacent to each other. So it seems that there are some optimal aggression levels that our model exhibits, which is an interesting trend, although we're still not sure if this is going to be a consistent or significant result. We also tried a different test where we started 10 different supercolonies at 10 different aggression levels, and once again, you do see some slight trends of convergence. You see that all the supercolonies kind of above the 0.8 range are converging downwards towards it, whereas the ones below are converging upwards towards it at a very slow rate, but still. And this test was also significant because it allowed us to see that an Argentina-like steady state does emerge, at least in the short term, even on a large 100 by 100 board, which is the board size we'll probably be using for our rigorous final experiments. And then when we did a pretty thorough rigorous testing of the test that I showed earlier, where we essentially dropped one invader into a dominant supercolony, we kind of see a qualitative support of our thought that essentially if you have a neutral supercolony, invasion can succeed. So you kind of have some interesting phenomena here. You see this large cluster of points along the bottom, as well as a different kind of distribution up here. And it seems like for an invader, there's always a chance that it will be eliminated from the onset. But once it surpasses some sort of threshold, it's able to persist either for a very long period of time in a neutral supercolony or for a relatively shorter period of time in an aggression supercolony. So you can see that based on only differences in aggression alone, there is a very large and distinguishable difference in the success of an invader into this dominant supercolony, which supports our theory that perhaps this could be the cause of collapse. And so for ongoing work into this project, we would like to run further test runs and experiments. So essentially everything we've been doing so far is seeing the effect of neutrality once it arises. So what we need to do at this point is ensure that our model has the capability to actually produce neutral colonies on their own through processes like genetic drift and mutation. And we're pretty optimistic that it will be able to do that. And then we'll make some little modifications to the models over time. And then after that, after we pass those test phases, then we would be able to establish a rigorous experimental procedure where we decide how exactly we're going to vary the parameters in the model, what specific cases to run, and then we'll be able to look at the results after that and see if our theory seems to hold. And so essentially, our model is mostly theoretical. We're not trying to fit our model or our parameters to any sort of data points. So essentially, the validity and importance of any significance we find would be that essentially we would hope that our theory would inform experimenters to go and try and confirm the predictions that we make. Because right now we see that in the literature, people don't necessarily investigate the things that would be associated with aggression-based supercolony collapse. So hopefully, if our model finds something significant, it would inspire experimenters to do things like track the geographic distribution of neutral ants within a large supercolony and establish a more rigorous and robust scale of defining aggression for Argentine ants. And if these experiments also coincide with the predictions that our model makes, then we can move on to the application phase where we would be able to conduct ecological restoration, doing something that seems counterintuitive, which would probably be introducing other Argentine ants from a different supercolony into a neutral region of a dominant supercolony to promote competition between them, which would allow native ants to regain some sort of foothold into their ecological niche. And so we would like to thank NIMBioS for funding us and bringing us into this summer, and as well as our mentors who agreed to continue working on this project even after this program. And so, yeah, thank you very much.